Last week, a federal judge denied a request to halt enforcement of a federal directive that forces religious schools to include single-sex housing facilities, to open single-sex housing facilities to members of the opposite sex. And this includes dorm rooms and shower rooms. So while this lawsuit moves forward, the College of the Ozarks in Missouri and other religious schools like it could face fines, easily amounting to 6 figures in addition to punitive damages and attorney's fees. Violations can even put someone in jail. So what's next for the school? And what does it mean for other organizations and companies? With me now to talk about this is Ryan Bangert, Senior Counsel and VP for Legal Strategy at Alliance Defending Freedom, which is representing College of the Ozarks. Ryan, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Joseph. Great to be here.
So glad to have you. Tell us a little bit about where this controversy came from. What is it the Biden administration did that led to this issue?
Well, the Biden administration on the first day, January 20th, issued an executive order, number 13988, that dictated to all federal agencies that statutes, regulations, any federal law that prohibited discrimination based on sex must be interpreted by the federal government, by all the federal agencies, by all the bureaucrats, to prohibit discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation. So this was a significant shift, a significant change in the way the federal government has interpreted sex discrimination statutes. And this is what drove the Housing and Urban Development Department, HUD, to, on February 11th, issue the directive that's at the center of this lawsuit. And that directive interprets the Fair Housing Act, which is a longstanding federal statute that prohibits discrimination in housing on, among other things, the basis of sex, to include prohibitions on gender identity discrimination. Now, when you play that out, what that does is it prohibits schools like College of the Ozarks from having single-sex dormitories where men who identify as women, who are transgender, from not living in the female dorms. That's ultimately the result of that interpretation.
Well, I will just say that College of the Ozarks is actually one of my favorite colleges in America. And if parents out there, if you're looking for a great place for your kids, think about College of the Ozarks. It really is a fabulous place. And you filed a lawsuit on their behalf seeking an injunction against this new rule, but you did not prevail. What was the judge's argument?
Well, first off, you're absolutely right. The College of the Ozarks is a fantastic place. It's been around for over 100 years. Everything they do is really centered on Christian values. And that's what informs the policy that the College of the Ozarks has of separating men and women into separate dorms. So it's very much an outgrowth of the College of the Ozarks religious beliefs. To your second question, what did Judge Ketchmark say? Well, she has not issued a written ruling yet, but at the hearing from the bench, which means when she is speaking after the arguments are concluded, she said that she was going to deny the motion that we had filed for a preliminary injunction on a couple of different bases, one of which is she just didn't believe that, in her view, the case was justiciable. Now, that's a big word. That's a legal word. What that means is she agreed with the government that this letter, this directive, nothing to see here. This is the way we've always done it. This is just simply a implementation of the Supreme Court's ruling in Bostock. It's not going to make any difference to schools like College of the Ozarks. But the reality is the government is just prevaricating. The government is simply sort of playing a shell game here with us. And it's a very, very common tactic that the government uses in cases like this to get them thrown out and dismissed. So we're going to be taking this up on appeal because it's very clear that the directive specifically mandates and requires that federal agencies that enforce the Fair Housing Act require everyone who's subject to the act, including College of the Ozarks, not to discriminate based on gender identity. That's baked right there into the directive. And it's called a directive on its face, not a suggestion, not a recommendation. It's a directive. And it was issued to all the federal enforcement agencies. Like you pointed out, they have authority to issue fines up to 6 figures.
Does the directive only cover colleges and universities that take federal funding from students, or would it apply to all institutions?
It's not dependent on receipt of federal funds, because the Fair Housing Act applies regardless of whether you receive federal money. Fair Housing Act applies if you are providing a dwelling place for sale or for rent. And of course, a dormitory is a dwelling place. It's some place that someone will live for at least a length of time. And so it applies to colleges and universities regardless of whether or not they receive federal funds.
So effectively, there is no way to escape the coverage of this directive. Is that correct? No religious exemption. You can't disentangle yourself financially from the federal government. This applies to everyone, regardless of your history, regardless of your beliefs, regardless of how you conduct yourself.
It does apply universally across the board if you're a university providing dormitories. Now, there's a very narrow exception in the Fair Housing Act that does apply as a co-religionist exception, but that's something that is really not an issue here. Now, there is an exception in Title IX, which governs education institutions that receive federal funding, but the Title IX exception applies to Title IX. We're talking about Title VIII, which is the Fair Housing Act. So all these different exceptions, and the government threw these arguments out at the oral argument, they just don't apply here. So the answer is there's universal application and there's no clear exception.
Now, Ryan, we got 1 minute, so very quickly, what is your argument on appeal? How do you get this rule struck down?
It's exactly what we argued at the district court. The government issued a final rule, and that final rule is binding on all the federal enforcement agencies, and it makes a difference. It has real world effects on schools like the College of the Ozarks. Ultimately, if it were to play out, it would force the schools to a choice. Either abandon your religious beliefs and allow transgender students, allow males to live in female dorms, or suffer the penalties.
Ryan Bangert, Alliance Defending Freedom, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you especially to you and everyone at the Alliance Defending Freedom for taking up these cases at no charge to them to defend our freedom. We do greatly appreciate you and your service to our country and to all of us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Joseph.